Thank you all for being here today for this webinar on how to do Firefly Atlas surveys with a question and answer session to hear your questions. So a little bit of background about the Xerces Society for those of you who may not be familiar. We're a science-based nonprofit that protects the natural world through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitats. We work within 4 main realms: endangered species, pollinator habitat and agricultural biodiversity, pesticide reduction, and community engagement. So most of my work falls within the endangered species program. The butterfly that you see pictured on this slide is the Xerces blue butterfly, which is the first insect known to go extinct in the United States due to human causes. It's both our namesake and a reminder of why we do the work we do. And Xerces is supported by an amazing community of members who make our work possible. So for any members watching today, I just want to say thank you. And if you'd like to become a member, you can do so on our website. Today's webinar has four main topics. First, I'm going to give an overview of why the Firefly Atlas was designed the way it was, with comparisons to some peer projects and an explanation of some of the unique aspects of Firefly community science. Next, and this will be the kind of the beefiest section, we're going to talk about Firefly flash patterns. So what is a flash pattern, and how do you document flash pattern details in a way that helps you reach a species identification? Next, we'll talk about photographing fireflies when your goal is species ID. And then finally, we'll go over a few common areas of confusion and mistakes, and then transition to answering your questions. I'm going to try and keep jargon to a minimum in this webinar, but there'll be a few terms that are pretty important to understand. While this webinar is pretty heavy on flash patterns and flashing fireflies, I want to remind you all that the Firefly Atlas is not just for flashing fireflies. So if you are in California or the Pacific Northwest, there are still opportunities to participate, and much of the rest of the webinar will still be applicable. So I have images up here of daytime dark fireflies, like this one in the Pacific Northwest, or like the California pink glowworm firefly photographed in Southern California. In case you haven't already seen it, I want to put on your radar that there's a training video that I recorded 2 years ago on the Xerces Society YouTube channel that really gives step-by-step instructions for how to do Firefly Atlas surveys and also submit data. This video is it's kind of long and it's pretty comprehensive. And today's webinar is going to focus on fewer topics, but we're going to dive in deeper to those topics. But I just wanted to make sure you know that this video exists, and it has a table of contents so you can find the section that you're looking for if you have a specific question. So let's dive into the first section, and that is, why is the Firefly Atlas set up the way that it is? This is kind of a polite way of saying, why is Firefly Atlas so darn complicated? Why are there so many steps and so many questions? Which is a very fair question. Zooming out just a little bit, the Firefly Atlas is a few things. It's a community science project with the goal of better understanding and conserving the diversity of fireflies in North America. So in that sense, it's a survey protocol and a data portal, but it's also a hub of information and resources for firefly research and conservation. And because it's a community science project, we welcome participation from all types of people, regardless of whether you have a background in science or whether you work in science or conservation professionally. One of the things that makes the Firefly Atlas unique is that it really has flexibility to collect and submit multiple types of Firefly data. So I'm going to explain these in more detail, but overall they include incidental observations, targeted surveys, general surveys or non-targeted surveys, and non-detection data. First little jargon alert or important terms to know really just has to do with the types of data that Firefly Atlas collects. So regardless of whether you do an incidental observation or a full survey, when you collect Firefly Atlas data, information goes into kind of two categories. The first is event or survey information, and this is related to place, time, people, the weather, all sorts of things that you would collect even if you don't see a single firefly. And then observation data is about the fireflies that you found and documented. One observation for the purposes of the Firefly Atlas is basically finding one species at one place at one time. If you look at the Firefly Atlas data sheets, which are available as PDFs on the website, you'll see that the front half of the data sheet is all event information. So that's the kind of the where, the when, the who, as in, who is surveying, how hard are you looking, all things that you would want to write down even if you didn't find a firefly. On the back of the data sheet are the questions related to observation. This is all about the fireflies that you actually find and documented. So I'm going to go through a few of the scenarios that you could of types of data collection with the Atlas. So an incidental observation, you find a firefly when you weren't looking for one or you weren't prepared to do a full survey. So we call this an incidental event, and you have a firefly observation attached to that event. You could do a targeted survey where you look for a particular species. Maybe it's a focal species of conservation concern or a data deficient species, or just one that you're interested in going to look for. And you either find it or you don't find it. And we call that, and there's no actual observation showing that non-detection data, but we can infer the lack of that observation. It tells us that you didn't find the species that you were looking for. You can also do a non-targeted survey where you just go out and look for fireflies, but you're not looking for a particular species. And a survey can be linked to observations of multiple species. So this helps because you don't have to enter the same information multiple times when that information is all about the survey or the event. So chances are you're familiar with the amazing community science platform iNaturalist. And if you're like me, maybe you're quite an active user on this site. If you do a quick search, you'll also find that there are thousands of firefly observations on iNaturalist. So why do we need a separate platform or a separate project? Firefly Atlas differs in several ways. One of them we just covered in previous slides, and that is that you can report non-detection data. And this is really helpful information that iNaturalist just does not collect. And it's information that helps us tell the actual rarity of species. If it's only, if there are only a few records, is that because they're truly rare, or is that just kind of a blip? And it also helps put in context the observations where they actually are found, the surveys where they are found. Firefly Atlas also records metrics of effort. So how long you looked, how much area you covered. Again, just putting in context that observation. And then finally, Firefly Atlas guides you through different types of questions with a goal of reaching a species level ID. So Unfortunately, many of the observations on iNaturalist will just never be identified beyond genus because a photo just isn't enough evidence. And the evidence that we really need to collect are things like flash pattern details, and then other contextual information that's just nice to have, like the weather and things like artificial light or other threats. Some of you may also be familiar with Firefly Watch, and maybe even contributed to this project. So Firefly Watch was run by the Museum of Science in Boston and then Massachusetts Audubon from 2008 to 2022. It's since become inactive. So some of you may have found out about Firefly Atlas because Firefly Watch started redirecting users towards us. And Firefly Watch participants would do these standardized stationary 10-second counts to track the presence and the sort of approximate abundance of flashing fireflies. But the protocol was never aimed at achieving species or even genus level identification. So they collected a lot of information and there was a lot of cool findings, but we never really knew what exactly we were looking at with Firefly Watch data. It was just fireflies in the aggregate. So at Firefly Atlas, we're also interested in things like abundance and seasonal timing, but really our main goal is to generate species records. And to do that, we need to gather a lot of different clues. So one of the things that makes Firefly surveys challenging and sometimes frustrating, but I think also rewarding, is that we need to act like detectives gathering different types of evidence. So for identification of many flashing species, flash pattern details are really helpful, and in many cases, they're essential. Think about how listening to bird calls will help birders distinguish between closely related species. It's kind of like that. And flash patterns are how fireflies identify each other, members of the same species. So really, we're just following their cue by tapping into these signals. Catching fireflies and taking close-up photos from multiple angles can also help us reach confident identification, or at least really narrow down the list of possibilities. So when we created Firefly Atlas, it was with the belief that community scientists can contribute valuable data by conducting non-lethal surveys, so not necessarily collecting specimens, that were combining flash pattern details and up-close photographs. That is this sweet spot whose potential has really not been realized when it comes to research. And I want to acknowledge that in some cases, a confident identification is only possible by collecting a male specimen and examining its genitalia under a microscope. Not so friendly to community science. So this photo is the Ediogus, or the penis, of a pointy-lobed firefly. When the common name of the firefly is based on the genitalia, you know that identification is going to be a tricky task. So insect collections and natural history museums will always have a really important role in firefly research, but there are cases where community science observations, like those collected by you all, actually provide more insight than a physical specimen. So along with those two big pieces of photographs and flash pattern details, there are other types of clues that they're not just interesting, but they can help us reach a species ID. So things like habitat, time in the evening, time of the year, and display height. So from here, I want to dive into the next section, and really the biggest section, which is figuring out firefly flash patterns. First, we're going to go over some definitions and terminology, walk through some examples with real species, and then we'll talk about how to gather flash pattern data. So beginning with the basics, this is how the late firefly expert Jim Lloyd defined a flash pattern. It's a unit of light emission by male fireflies that is repeated at somewhat regular intervals and which stimulates a female of his species to emit a flash response. So there are a few takeaways from this definition. First, while female fireflies can and do flash, when we talk about flash patterns, we're really talking about a male behavior. Second, a flash pattern is a pattern because it repeats. So to witness this repetition, you gotta take your time and be a little bit patient. And then finally, flash patterns are a courtship communication between members of the same species. And yeah, I want to stress that female flash behavior is fascinating and sophisticated, but the reason that we focus on flash patterns by males is that these are the flashes that best assist us with identification. Scientists have been collecting and naming fireflies for centuries. It goes back as far as Linnaeus, but it wasn't until the early 1900s that researchers really paid attention to the diversity and value of flash patterns for separating out species. So this diagram appears in a publication by Barber in 1951, and it illustrates flash patterns of different firefly species in the genus Photurus. You can read the diagram as a progression in time from left to right, with the vertical lines being the passage of a second. So the length of those flash markers is kind of how long the flash is. And if it gets thicker, that's sort of getting more intense in brightness. Researchers also discovered pretty early on that the timing of flash patterns is not static. It depends on the air temperature. So when it's colder, there's more time between flash patterns, and then when it gets hotter, those get closer together. So the big takeaway here is that flash pattern details should always be accompanied by an air temperature. And you can get this air temperature from a thermometer of really any kind. I know plenty of people who just use cheap cooking thermometers from the grocery store. You could use something fancier like a Kestrel weather meter. And it's less ideal, but a weather app or a weather website is a whole lot better than just not having any temperature data at all. So I want to point out that not all flashing by fireflies is a flash pattern. So here's some examples of that. So it could be flashes emitted by a firefly that you just caught or you found in a spider web. Not a flash pattern. Flashes emitted by a female firefly. That could be part of a courtship dialogue, but strictly speaking, it's not a pattern because it's not going to be repeated. Light emitted by larvae, like I hope that you all can find larvae while doing firefly surveys, and you'll find them usually by the light that they're giving off. But it's not a flash pattern. It's light, but it's not a flash pattern, following Lloyd's definition. And then I want to say to be very wary of flashes that are coming from perched fireflies. Sometimes these are from females, and sometimes they're from males that are just warming up for the evening. But if you're going to collect data about flash pattern, I would try really hard to get that from a firefly that is that's flashing on the wing and doing so kind of repeatedly. And then finally, random flashes that don't repeat. It may seem kind of obvious, but that's also not a flash pattern. Next little sort of jargon alert. Sometimes I feel kind of cruel because I'm taking something as magical as firefly flashes, and I'm turning them into these like technical terms and numerical measurements, which is not, it's not that dreamy. But I promise you that it's necessary and it's helpful for a species ID. So the Firefly Atlas datasheet is going to ask you to measure or estimate 3 parts of a flash pattern. In some ways, getting all 3 is kind of aspirational, but we're going to go through each of those pieces. So the flash pattern period is the time between the start of a flash pattern and the start of the next repetition of that pattern. So if you're only able to record one metric, one flash pattern metric, this is a good one to get. We also ask about flash duration. So that's how long an individual pulse of light lasts. Very kind of hard to measure in the field. So often this is a very rough estimate. And then finally, there's flash interval, which is this is going to look different for different species and flash patterns. So I think the best way to show it is through these examples. So I have three examples of very different flash patterns. This is the Big Dipper firefly or common eastern firefly, and their upward swooping flash pattern is really quite distinctive. If we break this down into the timing of the flash pattern, we'll get numbers that look something like this. So we'll have a flash pattern period of about 6 seconds. The flash duration is, again, flash duration is really hard to measure, but in this case, we are able to measure it. It's 0.7 seconds. If you weren't able to measure it, you could give a verbal description. So this is actually pretty long of a flash. So you could call it like leisurely or long, or just say that it's more than a half a second long. And then the flash interval is kind of the dark time. So that's the time between the end of a flash and the start of the next flash. In fireflies with simple flash patterns, so of single flashes, single relatively brief flashes, that's going to be essentially the same as the flash pattern period, and it's not all that helpful. But when you get to more complicated flash patterns, you'll see that it is helpful for being able to kind of reconstruct the flash pattern. So here's another example, and it's slightly more complex. This is a Photinus firefly whose flashes come in sets of 2. So if you kind of look at this image, you can make out the pairs of flashes. Again, the flash pattern period in this kind of hypothetical case is about 6 seconds. So 6 seconds from the start of the first pair of flashes to the start of the second pair of flashes. The flash duration is brief. It's much shorter than the Big Dipper, and it's actually probably too short to measure in the field. So we're just going to estimate that it's less than 1/3 of a second. We might even just say verbally that it's brief. And then finally, the flash interval is about 1.2 seconds. So if you provided me with these 3 flash pattern measurements, I should be able to draw out this flash pattern diagram and help me figure out what species we're looking at. And believe it or not, that flash interval in this case is what's going to help me figure out which of 3 different species of Photinus we're looking at here. My last example is a species with a pretty complex flash pattern. This is the loopy 5. It's a wetland species of the southeastern US that's of conservation concern. And Radim Schreiber, a photographer based in Iowa, captured this image of loopy 5 flash patterns over a marshy pond in eastern Tennessee. There's just one known locality in Tennessee of this species. So there's kind of a lot, if you look at these images, there's a lot going on that has to do with use of space and not just use of time. But the time measurements is obviously really focusing on what's happening in time. So again, we're going to put down the bones with those measurements. So the flash pattern period is pretty long. It's about 8 seconds. And there may be some variability. So we'd want to get multiple flash pattern periods and then maybe take an average or put down what we think is like kind of most typical, maybe the median. The flashes are quick, maybe about 1/10 of a second, though you can see that there's some variability too. These patterns seem to be ending with slightly longer glow-like flashes. And then the interval, again, is somewhat variable, but it's about half of a second between the pulses within the flash pattern. So now that you have an idea what these terms mean, you're probably wondering, how do you actually get these numbers? And the approach that was recommended to me by Firefly expert and field guide author Lynn Faust is to use a voice recorder. And this is what I recommend to folks who want to do Firefly surveys. So the way you do this is you can use any kind of voice recorder. It could be an old tape recorder. It could be a digital sound recorder. Or very conveniently, it could be the voice memo app on your phone. Hit record, and you'll want to say the time, the location, and the air temperature. Again, the air temperature. And then the next step is to find your bug. So when I say find your bug, I mean find a flashing firefly that you can visually track its flashes. And this is a hard thing to do. It takes practice. It takes focus, but it is possible. It helps to find one that's relatively close to you and one that's not kind of blocked by too many bushes, for example. And then as you follow the flashes, you want to kind of narrate the flashes that you see into the recorder. So this, for loopy 5 flash pattern, for example, this might look like me saying into my recorder, it's 9:30 p.m. I'm at the beaver marsh, and I'm, here's what the flashes are doing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then there'll be a long pause, and I will, narrate what I see. You could also, some people might be very literal and say, flash, flash, flash. And I even know some people who just make a sound with their, a nonsense sound with their tongue, and that just gets registered by the voice recorder. At some point, inevitably, you're going to lose track of that lightning bug, and to mark that in the recording, I like to say like new bug or new recording, just to make it clear that you're moving on to a different firefly. And then I recommend processing this recording later when the survey is done. And so on the data sheet, these measurements, I recommend actually filling that in once you're back from the field and ready to be kind of looking at paper instead of looking at fireflies. The great thing about audio is that you can use software relatively easily to visualize your voice recordings. So this image on the right is a visualization of my voice recording of the flashes that I'm seeing of a loopy 5 firefly, and you can see the timing here. So you can see that there are 5 pulses. The pulses towards the end are longer because I kind of drew out my voice as I was watching the firefly. And you can see that the whole thing takes about 2.5 seconds. I recently learned that some voice memo apps actually create these automatically, and it's just a matter of pressing a few buttons or pressing a few things on your phone to achieve that. So again, some advantages of voice recordings. I think a really big one is avoiding needing to write in the dark. The other methods, a lot of them will rely on jotting down notes with a pencil, which is a pain in the dark. And the more you can just be focused on the fireflies with your eyes, the better. With voice recordings, it's not perfect, but I think it is accurate to a few tenths of a second. And that's, I think, good enough for our purposes. And then lastly, you can, with a voice recorder, you can collect a lot of data relatively easily that you can then process later. So this isn't the only method, and it might not work for everyone. So a few other methods would be using the 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi method. This is simple, and you don't need any software, you don't need any device. But it's not very accurate, and then you still have to write that down somewhere, or make a note into a voice recorder. And if you're already using a voice recorder, why not just go ahead and use the voice recorder for that purpose? You can also use a stopwatch with a split or lap function. That might actually be a little more accurate, but it just requires more steps for keeping track of what you're seeing. One question I get is, why not just take a video? I think this is a very common instinct. I've felt this instinct myself. I have lots of videos, and sometimes they're helpful, but most of the time, they're not very helpful for getting flash pattern details. So I'm going to play this video and think about whether you would be able to get like flash pattern period from this video. So a big challenge with video is that it almost collects too much data. And following the flashes of a single firefly is kind of like following one snowflake in a blizzard. So yeah, disadvantages of video is that it's often too hard to follow one firefly's flash pattern, especially if there are a lot of fireflies in the video. Analyzing it's easy to take the video, but then analyzing them and getting the information you need is either labor intensive and or technologically intensive. And then lastly, the Firefly Atlas website is just not set up to receive videos. So you're going to need to process that video yourself. So what about long exposure photos? These can be quite beautiful and evocative, but I think they're most helpful as a supplemental tool because you really don't learn much about the timing of the flashes from a single individual. It's most helpful for looking at flash patterns of fireflies with a kind of more complicated flash patterns and those that involve some distinctive movement through space, kind of like that loopy 5 who is bobbing up and down. I've had some folks try and take the approach of counting the flashes in a 10-second period and then trying to, or some time period, and then trying to figure out the flash pattern from that. And these diagrams kind of illustrate the problem with this approach. So you can see there are 3 fireflies with very distinct flash patterns. One's a single flasher, one's a double flasher, excuse me, and one is probably a multi-pulse flash pattern, and you just haven't seen the next repetition. But they all have 6 flashes within a 10-second period. So the truth is that measuring firefly flash patterns is one of the most challenging aspects of firefly surveys. And so if you feel overwhelmed or discouraged, I'd say 2 things. First, like all things, it gets easier with practice. And second, when numbers fail us, we can turn to words. So unleashing your inner poet can actually help you to communicate what the flash pattern looks like. And there are actually some terms that even researchers who are doing lots of quantitative stuff use, things like crescendos. So that's a flash that starts relatively dim, it gets brighter and brighter, and then it stops. Or you can have flickers. That's kind of a string of very short flashes given in tight sequence. A glow would be a flash that's long, say like a second long or even more than that. You can have dot dashes like in Morse code. So I'd say, unleash your creativity. It's a really good complement to this more kind of quantitative approach. So I'm going to open up, take just a few minutes just to get focus on questions related to flash patterns, and then there's 2 more sections I would like to hit. So feel free to put your questions about flash patterns in the Q&A, It's okay if we don't have any yet. There'll be a more extensive Q&A in a few minutes. Yeah, so I have the question, is there relevant data you've been able to capture on a wildlife cam? And I would say that wildlife cams, what they're best for is just telling whether there are fireflies in a remote area, in places that are like hard to survey at the right time of year. So I don't think you could really get flash pattern details, but you may get a sense of like, oh, I think this is a single flasher. A lot of times the photos that show more flashes, they're long exposures or they're composite images, which is a little different than what a game cam is doing. Next question, and there was a follow-up question of settings on wildlife cameras. Yes, I don't know the specifics, but I could, Rochelle, I could direct you to folks who have done more work here. I'd happy to do that. Carly asks, is there a good way to record direction or movement? Should we just draw it? I would say, painting a verbal picture works well, whether you say it's bobbing up and down or it's swooping up or kind of dropping. Those are all good ways. It's not going to come across in a quantitative way. We have a question that says recommendations on audio software to convert dictation to timing. So what I have used in the past it's actually birdsong software from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and they have a free version called Raven Lite, Lite, and that has given me the functionality that I need. It's nice because you can sort of click and drag to get those measurements, so you don't have to do any little mental math in your head. Question of how do you isolate a single insect to monitor any tricks? It takes practice and I think just diving in, but a few tips I would say that finding an area where there's actually less flash activity can be helpful. So if you're kind of at the edge of the display zone, also surveying kind of at the beginning of the end of the display season, there'll be fewer fireflies and it might be easier to just follow one. You're probably going to sort of curse a bunch as you lose track of fireflies. I have many audio recordings where I start counting and after the first flash, I'm like, darn, lost it, new bug. Tips on how to deal with fireflies at the top of trees, difficult to isolate one firefly. Honestly, that's a hard one that I've not been able to really crack. But if there are lower, trees lower down, getting as close as you can makes a big difference. And maybe this is a case where video could be your friend, though hard to say. I'm going to continue. Thank you for all these awesome questions. I'm going to continue on. If there are more questions about flash patterns, that's great. I just want to make sure we cover the next few sections. So the next section is about photographing fireflies for Firefly Atlas. So when someone sends me a firefly photo, my first question is often, did you take a photo of the underside? Because the belly, a view of the belly of the firefly gives you a lot of information that helps to narrow down the possible species and also to determine the sex of the firefly. So it shows you things like the hind coxae or the legs leg segment that's closest to the thorax. The coloration of the abdominal segments is often quite helpful. And then you can get views of the lanterns, which is helpful for knowing the genus and for knowing the sex of the firefly. Excuse me. You should also take a photo of the backside or the dorsal side. And I've labeled a few of the body parts that can help to narrow down possible species. So you have the pronotum or the head shield, the scutellum, which is the little kind of triangle where the wings meet at the base, or the outer wings, the elytra, meet at the base, and the pygidium, which is you can kind of think of it as the tail. It's the last abdominal segment, what sticks out. And you can see in this photo, it was taken through a clear plastic bag, and it's up against the millimeter scale, which is on the Firefly Atlas data sheet. So I know just from the photo how many millimeters long it is. A few other helpful close-up shots can be like really zooming in on the pronotum or the kind of zooming in on the lanterns. So what if the camera you're working with is just your phone camera? This makes it more challenging. It can be a little limiting, but I have seen Firefly Atlas observations that were identifiable to species with a phone camera. So a few tips to kind of like get the most out of these images is to use a headlamp or a flashlight instead of the flash. And then also make sure that's a white light. So if you should be using a red headlamp for most of your survey, but a photo that's illuminated with the red headlamp the firefly is just gonna look red. So make sure it's white light. Get your lens as close as possible, and it can be helpful to kind of put your hand or a piece of paper behind the firefly. You can use the data sheet with the scale bars, quite helpful, and that will help your camera focus on the firefly. And then lastly, you can crop the photo afterward before submitting it to the atlas, and that helps those of us who are trying to figure out what species it is. There may be cases where you just can't get a photo. It's fireflies that are 30 feet up in a tree, or maybe you don't have a camera with you. In these cases, I would say really try and get good flash pattern details. And even then, you probably won't get to a species level identification unless the flash pattern is really distinctive and you document it really well. Maybe there's something unique about its phenology, like a spring treetop flasher flashing in April. There's just nothing else that will be in many parts of the country. Or in some cases, maybe you've already, or other people have generated records that have been verified with photos from the same site. So if you can't get photos, I would say please still keep submitting data, but make sure that you're really getting the most out of the other sections. So just recap of the photos, get as close as you can, get both the back and the belly or the dorsal and ventral views. Use a clear sandwich bag or a petri dish to get the views that you need. You use a millimeter scale in the background so we know how long it is. When you're taking photos, use white light, not red light. I want to transition to Q&A, the rest of the Q&A very soon, but just have a couple more slides focused on kind of common mistakes that I've seen pop up repeatedly. So the first is recording the flash behavior of a perched female firefly. And I think the reason this happens is because sometimes fireflies are hard to catch. So you're like, well, I'll get the flash pattern of that one that's down low and it's perched on a bush, and then I'll catch that firefly. And again, the female flash behavior, it's fascinating and worthy of study, but it's much harder to use for species ID. So you can, the best thing is to try and just catch a firefly that's flashing repeatedly on the wing, and then you can double check the sex by looking at the lanterns. And the females will have lanterns that are either smaller or fewer in number compared to the males. So this is a female photourus, and you can see that her lanterns aren't filling the whole segment. Another mistake is to see a series of flashes and kind of assume that that's the pattern. So sometimes people will see a firefly flash 4 times and then assume that its flash pattern is a multi-pulse pattern, like it has 4 flashes. But the issue here is that a single flashing firefly is still going to take breaks from flashing. So you want to watch it long enough to make sure that those 4 flashes are actually repeated predictably, and it's not just a single flasher that does kind of a run of 4 flashes, and then it does a run of 9 flashes, and it's quite variable. This is a mistake that I'm sometimes guilty of, and that is kind of rushing to identify a firefly before I document it. And this leads to records that are hard to verify and sometimes a little circular in logic. So it's a very natural impulse to want to identify what you're seeing, but I would urge folks to still take all the bits, gather all the clues, and then those clues should speak for themselves rather than just saying, oh, it was doing the Big Dipper flash pattern. That's very different than saying upward swooping flashes with the flash pattern period of 5 seconds at 75 degrees. And in the atlas, it's better to have a well-documented unknown firefly than an observation that has an identification but doesn't really have the evidence to back up that identification. And then lastly, when submitting data, an easy mistake to make is to not actually only fill out the first half of the form. And so it's like saving the event survey, but not adding the observation to it. So don't leave your observations behind, and make sure that you click on add observation after you have saved your event survey. So we have about 10 minutes for questions, and I can stay on a little past the hour if people have burning questions. Let's open up the Q&A again. So I see one from Rochelle. It says, will I be sharing resources on display season by species? This is something that we've put together some species checklists by region for a few regions that include phenology. Unfortunately, for some of these species, it's gonna vary by place, which makes that task complicated. And for some of them, we don't really know if we just have a handful of records. Maybe they're all from July, but we don't know what they're doing in June or August. So this is where Firefly Atlas data, would really help us fill in those gaps. While we're waiting for more questions to come in, I just want to acknowledge Lynn Faust, the author of the Firefly Field Guide, who's really guided me in this journey of figuring out how to do Firefly surveys. For me, it's been a little over 3 years of doing this, and I'm still learning, but she has really helped guide the way. And I would also just want to end with the idea that, I think that you'll collect the best data if you're really having fun doing it. So if you're feeling like this is diminishing the magic of fireflies, maybe make sure that during your surveys you step back and just enjoy the fireflies. so that it's not feeling like too much like work. Back to the Q&A. So in addition to the physical data sheet, is there an app to record the data directly in lieu of or after its capture on the physical form? Unfortunately, there is not an app. So the best way to submit data is via the website, on a computer. And the way I think with the physical data sheet, my approach to it is to pre-fill anything that you can fill out at the very beginning of the survey, and then use it as more as a checklist than something you need to fill out. You need to gather that information, so maybe you do jot it down. But if you use your voice recorder, you can reduce the amount of time that you're fiddling with the clipboard. That's a great question, and potentially area for improvement. So thank you. I have a question that says, my go-to spot seems to have many that pretty much stay low in a marsh wetland and many that are high up in the top of tree canopy. What's your advice on those different patterns? I've been under the impression that the fireflies that stay systematically low tend to be females. Is this true or not? It's a generalization, but that might be very relative. Like there are some fireflies I know that they're flashing, the males are flashing just like maybe 12 inches above the tops of the vegetation, and then the females are perched at the tips of the vegetation. Yeah, so it's in different habitats that's going to look different, and there are females that are flying around and flashing. This is particularly true for the photourus. So it's they can really confuse you, and that's hard to get around that. I have a question: where can fireflies typically be found? Near water, for example. Looks like Candace is typing an answer directly. Often that's the case, especially if you're in the West. If you're in Arizona or Nevada, that is definitely going to be true. Wetlands tend to have great fireflies regardless of where you are. Brenda asks, can you do this in your own yard? Absolutely. If there's habitat that supports fireflies, or even if it seems like there should be fireflies and they're not, the protocol has the flexibility to do all types of different habitats. I have a question about how to identify male versus female fireflies when they're in flight, or you can see their underside. I would say this kind of echoes what I said earlier. It can be frustrating, particularly with photourus, but if flashes seem pretty random and not, yeah, it can be hard. Females, I would say sometimes they're moving quite quickly. That's one thing that we'll find in the females that are hunting other fireflies. These are the photourus that are particularly confusing and frustrating. Sometimes, even without shining a light on one, you can see that the lanterns are smaller or kind of full-fledged. So that's a good way. If the lantern is clearly small, then it's probably a female. Rosalind asks, following up on a previous question, when males are flashing in treetops, would females be perched up there too? This is a question I've wondered about myself, and I think so. But we don't think that fireflies lay their eggs in treetops. So the females, at some point, they're going to come down to the soil level to lay eggs. Maybe trees are a good sort of gathering point for fireflies. So females are actually flying up there too, and they'll be perched, but way up there. I think when fireflies are way up in the trees, it's one of the most kind of mysterious and frustrating things for surveyors, because it's really hard for us to see like what's actually going on. Be awesome to do like a canopy tower, set up a canopy tower to watch these guys. We are at the hour, so I'm happy to stay on for another 5 to 10 minutes. But for those of you that need to hop off, thank you so much for your time. Feel free to reach out with follow-up questions. You can reach me at richard.joyce@xerces.org, or at Firefly Atlas at xerces.org. Really happy to communicate with you one-on-one. And I hope to see your observations in the Atlas as well. We have for those of you that can stay on, there's a question, do they pollinate? The answer is sometimes, we think. So there are some fireflies that will visit flowers, but they're not, most of their food is coming during their larval phase, and it's coming from eating things like slugs and snails. As adults, they might, who can resist sugar water, but they're not consistently going to flowers. Question about whether you need to register for the Atlas to survey, or you can simply download the form and begin. Is there an official start date? The answer is you can get started now, and you don't need to. Creating an account is what you need to submit data, but you could do a bunch of surveys and submit that later. There's no official start date because we cover the entire country, and in Florida, you might be able to find fireflies year-round, whereas in more northern places, you might find them April through August or something like that. Generalization, this is a great question. Is there a generalization for what temperatures are too cold or too hot? I don't really know. I've never seen it being too hot. Heat may depress activity a little bit, but there'll probably still be fireflies. It depends on the species. But I would say for most species, getting below like 60 degrees Fahrenheit, there's a very limited number of species that will be out and flashing. If it's in the 70s, you're golden. If the temp's like 65, things may be a little slower. I had the question, when you find them in milkweed, are they imbibing the flower's toxins for protection? I don't think this has been studied super well. I think that's a great hypothesis, and it would be a good explanation for why milkweed in particular seems to be attractive to fireflies. But I don't think we've figured out the actual chemical pathways for that. Great question. Got a question, do they benefit from leaf litter? The question is, the answer to that is yes. And we know this not necessarily from experiments or very specific studies, but we know that from what we know about their life history and about their prey, and also about where we find them. So leaf litters holding in moisture, which is good for their prey. It's also good for them. Leaf litter will also help insulate from extreme temperatures during the winter or during really hot weather. And if you just look where you find fireflies, particularly for fireflies that are adapted to kind of forests instead of fields, leaf litter is an essential part of where they spend their lives. There's a question on resource guides that I would recommend. Is the flash pattern document from the 50s. Is that on the website? Under Learn, the Firefly Atlas, under the Learn tab, we have some links to keys. And I think one of the things that's challenging is that there's a field guide that's by Lynn Faust that's really good for the Eastern US, but there are species that just aren't included in it, so it's not comprehensive. If there are resources that are not on the website, linked on the website that you're interested in, I'm happy to kind of connect you with where to find those. And we're also at Xerces, we're working on creating some tools that would basically be a species list that you can filter based on like number of flashes in the flash pattern or how long it is, that would help you narrow down the options. Matthew asks, can I recommend a good manufacturer for insect nets? That he's been frustrated with the ones that he can buy online, and he's actually made his own net. I'm afraid that my net is still from when BioQuip was active, so I don't have a great recommendation. It can be a challenge, and when you're catching fireflies in the dark, it's a little easier to snag them on vegetation, which is a challenge. Yeah, sorry to not have a more helpful answer, Matthew, but maybe Candace will chime in. Question about negative impacts on populations from pesticides. This is a hard one because everything that we know about fireflies and pesticides tells us that it's a real cause for concern, because pesticides, a lot of what we're putting out there, even if it's not with a goal of killing fireflies, fireflies are affected in the same way that a lawn grub is affected, or other insect pests. But the research is pretty slim. There are some studies that show fireflies, even when they're not killed, their behavior will be affected. And there's so many chemicals out there that it's hard to have a comprehensive sense. There are definitely some anecdotal reports of fireflies disappearing from places with heavy spraying, including by herbicides, which is interesting, and could be more to do with like changes to the habitat than direct impacts. There's a recent fact sheet that Xerces put together called Protecting Fireflies from Pesticides. That is a good kind of overview of what we know and what to, things to avoid with pesticides and fireflies. Yeah, seems like we're getting to the last of the questions here. Thanks for sitting through, an hour-long plus Zoom webinar. And yeah, please do feel free to reach out. I'm excited to hear what you find and what your experiences are like surveying for fireflies this year. And if anything is frustrating about the Atlas protocol, yeah, feel free to send that to me too. It's helpful information to know, and I may have some tips for how to make it a little less frustrating. With that, we will end. We're going to go ahead and end the webinar. Thank you all for your time, and happy fireflying.